Good morning. Today is Sunday, July 23rd, 2023. I mentioned this recently. The Talmud gives 5 reasons why Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, is a day of mourning for the Jewish people. And we discussed all 5 of them. Of course, 2 are the destruction of the first temple and the destruction of the second temple. But number 5 on the list is that the area of the Beis HaMikdash, the second temple, after it was destroyed, was plowed over by Turnus Rufus, the Roman general. It was plowed over into a field. And the question is, why does that make the list? After all, yes, it's an abominable thing, but the Beis HaMikdash had already been destroyed. Jerusalem had already been, the people had been exiled. It had already happened. This is something that Turnus Rufus did later. Why does this rate being one of the 5 reasons that Tisha B'Av is such a terrible day? So you may remember recently we discussed this question, and I shared one answer with you. Today, I want to share another answer from Rabbi Moshe Kormornick. And it goes like this. The Roman general Turnus Rufus realized that even though the Beis HaMikdash had been destroyed, the Holy Temple in Jerusalem had been destroyed by him and his army, when the Jewish people would come to see the ruins, they would remember what was once there, and they would feel the pain of the destruction, and they would cry all over again, and that would cause that they would remain connected to the Beis HaMikdash and pray and act so that it would be rebuilt, and they would never get used to being subservient to the Roman Empire. So, in order to remove our connection to this holy site and to sever all ties with our past, Turnus Rufus wanted not only to destroy the Beis HaMikdash, but also to remove any remnants of what was there, to remove the ruin. So he plowed it over into a field so that it was not even recognizable what had once stood there. And our sages understood that this act was a completely new and different form of destruction. It was causing damage that would affect generations to come who would never be able to connect to this holy place, and therefore would not be able to mourn for it properly, and therefore not be able to pray for it to be rebuilt. And so this itself was one of the 5 reasons for turning this day into a national day of mourning. I told this story yesterday. To me, it's a very powerful story that I heard from Rabbi Yechiel Spiro. There was a man, a religious man, lived in New York. His name is Yosef Goldenfeld. And he and his family lived, and his father had been ill. And Nebuch, his father, passed away in the nighttime. And when his family woke up, they saw their father, they saw Yosef, the husband, father. He was very sad. He told them what had happened in the middle of the night. Of course, he was broken. His father had just passed away. But he was not visibly emotional. He was composed, but of course he was very sad and very broken. And then he said to his family, I have to leave now. I have to go tell my mother that her husband, my father, passed away. He came back about an hour later. He came into his house and he started sobbing and crying and weeping. So his family said to him, how is it that when you told us earlier what happened and it was immediate, you were composed, and now you're sobbing? Your emotion is visible. What could possibly be worse? What happened in the last hour that could possibly be worse than the death of your father? So he said to them, well, I went to tell my mother that her husband, my father, had passed away. And all she could say was, "Oh," because his mother has Alzheimer's. And she did not even know who he was talking about. And he started to cry again. And he said, "I don't know what's worse, that my father died or that my mother doesn't even feel the loss." Rabbi Yoni Lavi uses this metaphor to try to explain the predicament in which we find ourselves. Imagine if you grew up in an imaginary world where you were taught that marriage, what is marriage? Marriage means that a man and a woman send a text to each other once a week and they have a phone conversation once a month. That's what it means to be married. And you grew up in this imaginary world where you had no idea that there was such a thing as marriage that had a completely different level of communication and connection, that had intimacy on an ongoing basis. You just never understood. You never realized that marriage was such a thing that could be so much deeper and so much more meaningful. And therefore, you don't even know what to strive for in a marriage. Tisha B'Av, for us, requires imagination to mourn that which we have never experienced. And for that reason, the Rav, Rabbi Yosef Soloveitchik, explains we need help. On Tisha B'Av morning, this coming Thursday morning, there's a Torah reading, there's also a Haftorah. And the Haftorah is a passage from Yirmiyahu, the prophet Jeremiah. Excuse me. And we read the following verse. Ka'amar Shem Tzvakos. This is what God, the Lord of hosts, says. His bonanu, consider this, think about this deeply. V'karu l'mekonanos, and call the mekonanos. Now, mekonanos were, in ancient times, professional mourners, usually women. And what you would do is you would hire them if, God forbid, you're arranging a funeral. You would hire these professional mourners, these women, and they would come to the funeral and they would wail and cry, and everyone else would wail and cry. It would arouse the emotions of everyone else to feel what they should be feeling on the loss of this person who passed away. So the Navi, Hashem says through the prophet Jeremiah, call the Mekonanos, Fatisena Aleinu Nehi, and they will start to weep and to wail and to cry, Vateradna Einenu Dima, and then we will be able to arouse our tears to flow for the destruction of Jerusalem and the dispersal of the Jewish people. And the Rav explains that you call them Mekonanos. We need to call them Mekonanos, these professional mourners, because we have to be instructed how to mourn. It doesn't come naturally to us like it would if, God forbid, we suffer the loss of someone close to us. It doesn't come naturally because we never experienced it, so we don't even know what we're missing. So we have to learn in order to appreciate what it is that we are missing, because it's not obvious to us. We never experienced it. So I want to share with you a couple of insights very briefly from Erica Brown, Dr. Erica Brown, that come from a remarkable book that she wrote a few years ago, In the Narrow Places, which is about this period of time, the 3 weeks leading up to Tisha B'Av. And she observes that to understand the destruction, we have to look at the building, the Beis HaMikdash, the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, and to see what that meant to the Jewish people, to us, in order to recognize, appreciate what we no longer have. So Let me start with a lesson that I have shared with you before. Going back to the Parsha of Truma in the book of Shmos, when God tells Moshe to command the Jewish people to build the Mishkan, to build the sanctuary that later becomes the Beis HaMikdash, the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. But at first, it was the Mishkan, this portable sanctuary that traveled with the Jews throughout the desert, and the first 400 years they were in Israel, until finally it was located and settled in Jerusalem, and a permanent building was built, first worked on by David, and then Shlomo, King Solomon. But when God commands this, God says the following words, V'asu li migdash, make for me a sanctuary, God says to the Jewish people, V'shalchanti b'socham, and I will dwell. Now here's the word. It doesn't say I will dwell in it. Make for me a sanctuary and I will dwell in it. That would seem to be logical, but that's not what the words say. Asu li migdash, make for me a sanctuary, v'shalchanti b'socham, and I will dwell within you. Within each and every one of you, us, the Jewish people. Build a house, God says, so that God can live in you. This is an invitation by God to the Jewish people after Sinai, an invitation to intimacy with God, to a relationship of intimacy with God. And we refer to this building, the permanent structure in Jerusalem, as the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple. But Beit HaMikdash means the house of holiness, the home of holiness. A bayis, a home, is a personal space. It's not an open, public, formal place. It's a personal, intimate place where one is revealed in their private life. If you come to my home, you see who I am, how I live. Try to imagine. It's not an accident that it's referred to as Beit HaMikdash, the home of holiness, the home of God. Try to imagine if you could feel intimate with God. If you could feel enveloped, protected by God's presence, invited into his home. Who among us can say that we have ever felt this? And who among us wouldn't do anything or give anything to feel that? And imagine if the language of that intimacy was prayer. Imagine what ADATH would be, what any synagogue would be, if we really felt that the words of prayer we say here in Shul could achieve what the prophet Isaiah promises. V'hayaterem yikro vani ene. As soon as you speak the words to me, God says, I will already have answered you. Od he medabrim vani eshma. While you are still speaking, I will be hearing and responding to your prayers, God says. That is v'shalchanti b'socham. I will dwell within you. It's kind of like instant messenger. And that's what we're missing. Well, I'll tell you what it would be like if our synagogues were like that. The first thing is our synagogues would be full. And not because of innovative programming or inspiring speeches or delicious kiddush, but because people wanted to come closer to God once they realized that it was possible, achievable, and realized that the synagogue is the place to do it. That's what we had in the Beis HaMikdash when the Holy Temple was standing in Jerusalem, and that is what we lost in the destruction in the Korban. Another element. The focus on Tisha B'Av should not just be on the burned stones, the destroyed building, but the destroyed community. The destroyed connection between individuals and families and communities. Imagine, during the time the Beit HaMikdash was standing, 3 times a year, Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot, every year, every single Jewish person gathered in Jerusalem for the Yom Tov, for the holiday. The entire Jewish people gathered around the Beis HaMikdash. It was the focal point with physical proximity of every single Jewish person. First of all, can you imagine if 3 times every year you had the opportunity to see every single Jewish person you ever knew in your life? Every family member, every relative, every friend, every acquaintance, every role model, you could see them in person 3 times a year. Imagine the closeness that would be created by that. But more than that, Dr. Brown writes, there is something transcendent about being in a place shared by tens of thousands of people with a similar mission and vision. There is something deeply moving about atonement, guilt, thanksgiving, and joy when it is celebrated collectively rather than merely personally. Today, Judaism is an expression of self much more than it is an expression of the collective. When was the last time that you personally were part of a large-scale Jewish movement of any type whatsoever? Let's say, when was the last time that you were one of a gathering of Jews of 100,000 or more? Dr. Brown writes, we have no causes today, only organizations. With the Churban, with the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, we have no gathering place for our passions and our causes. The only place that comes close, maybe in a pale sense, is the Kotel. But that was the Beis HaMikdash when it stood. It was the Churban, the destruction that we mourn on Tisha B'Av, was the destruction of the true meaning of community. What we mourn on Tisha B'Av is not just the building, but the builders. But the deepest lesson of Tisha B'Av is that we can get it back. Eli Wiesel wrote, because I remember, I despair. Because I remember, I have a duty to reject despair. The next to the last verse of Eicha, the Book of Lamentations, that we will read this Wednesday night, the thought that should stay with us as Tisha B'Av ends and we continue on in our lives, Hashivenu Hashem Elecha, return us to you, God, v'nashuva, and we will come back. Chadesh Yameinu Kikedem, renew our days, renew our intimacy, renew our closeness, renew our community connection, the way that it existed when the Beis HaMikdash was standing. We can regain that majestic community of Israel. We can regain that intimacy with God. We can regain the language for that intimacy within our prayers. But it takes a lot of work. And the time for that work is now. My friends, I wish you a great day, and I look forward to seeing you soon in person.